These are the eras of college football explained. First things first, we have to start with the origins of football. American football goes back to traditional football games being played locally throughout Europe for centuries before the US was even formed. These games are pretty much mob football, a highly chaotic English football game with little rules or regulations. The game started to become more organized with intramural games in the 1700s, and the 1800s organized groups started to form in English public schools. Legend has it that while attending rugby school, William Webb Ellis picked up the ball and ran with it during a football game, thus creating rugby. Soon, football would make its way across the pond, being played at American schools, with each school playing their own style and having their own traditions. For instance, Princeton played its own game called Balown, while Dartmouth called theirs Old Division Football. No matter what it was called, it was still a violent, barbaric game with no rules and where injuries were common. The most notorious of these games was Harvard's Bloody Monday, which started in 1827 and was as violent as it sounds, as the entire freshman and sophomore classes bum-rushed each other and were described as kicking at anything, trying to move the ball past the wall of the other class and over the goal line. It was so violent that there were widespread protests throughout the universities to cancel the games altogether. Even Yale banned football for a while, but soon the game would return, bigger than before. In 1862, the Oneida Football Club was the oldest known football team in the United States, not just random people throwing themselves at each other. Even though it was short-lived, the Oneida Football Club was the start of college football as we know it. Next up was the pre-forward pass era. The first college football game was played on November 6, 1869 in New Brunswick, New Jersey. It was more like soccer than the gridiron football we know today, with even Rutgers captain William J. Leggett suggesting using rules set by the Football Association, or the FA. This game included two teams of 28 players, with the main objective to kick the ball through the goal post. Neither throwing nor carrying the ball was allowed, but you could be as physical as possible. In the end, Rutgers ended up winning 6-4. Their rematch included rule changes, like the ability to give a free kick to any player who caught the ball on the fly. Interestingly enough, this rule still exists today even though it's not used. But even with the rule changes, the game still remained too violent, and the outcry was so bad that there were no games played at all in 1871. But the game would come back again in 1872 with teams like Yale, Stevens Tech, NYU, and CCNY forming their own football teams. The game was still evolving with games now being 45-minute halves and played with 20 players on the field at a time. In October of 1873, four schools, Yale, Columbia, Princeton, and Rutgers, met and agreed upon a set of rules. Harvard was doing its own thing and came up with the Boston game, which had modern innovations like running with the ball, passing, and dribbling the football. You could tackle, but hitting or tripping was not allowed. In 1874, they decided to play a Canadian rugby team called McGill in a two-game series, one by the Harvard rules and one by McGill's rugby rules. Harvard won the first one by their rules but played to a 0-0 tie in the next one. They really liked McGill's rugby rules, particularly the try rule, which would evolve into the touchdown. In 1875, Harvard would play another important game against Tufts, where the rules included each side fielding 11 men, the football advancing by kicking or carrying the ball, and tackling the ball player to stop play. Later that year, Harvard would play Yale in a battle of Harvard's rugby style versus Yale's soccer style. Harvard won 4-0 and won the ideological battle, with future teams adopting their rugby style of play. Imagine if Yale would have won. American football might have been played like soccer. On November 23, 1876, Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and Yale met to agree on rugby-style rules, and Harvard, Columbia, and Princeton formed the Intercollegiate Football Association. Walter Camp, a Yale student, attended these meetings and would become arguably the game's greatest innovator, introducing things like the line of scrimmage, snapping from the center to the quarterback, reducing the field to 100 yards plus two 10-yard end zones, referees, All-American teams, and implementing direct scores with touchdowns, point after kicks, field goals, and safeties. During the next few years, college football went national, with teams starting to pop up everywhere in every region of the country, with schools like Michigan, Virginia, and Oklahoma starting up football programs. That meant the creation of new rivalries like Texas-Oklahoma, Alabama-Auburn, and most famously, Michigan-Ohio State. Conferences soon followed, with the Big Ten becoming the first conference in 1895. This era would also introduce black players to the sport, including stars William H. Lewis, the first African-American player for Harvard, and George Jewett, who in 1890 would be the second ever black player, playing for first Michigan and then Northwestern. Soon, schools like Ohio State, Nebraska, Indiana, and Iowa fielded their own black players. This era even brought the first bowl game, the Rose Bowl, played between Michigan and Stanford on January 1st, 1902, with Michigan winning 49-0. Originally played to bring tourism to Pasadena, California, this game became the blueprint for all postseason games to follow, with 46 bowl games being played by the 2025 season. As football was exploding, the violence that caused its popularity, though, would soon almost kill the game altogether. College football was evolving. The pre-forward pass era would give way to a new era, the pre-pull era, which introduced the NCAA in the modern game. As the popularity of football increased, so did the level of violence. Between 1890 and 1905, over 330 players died from football-related injuries. The main reason was the formations being used, like the flying wedge, which was essentially a line of players running headfirst directly into the opposing team's line. These collisions led to serious injuries and even death. Even President Teddy Roosevelt saw the dangers of football and called for a meeting of football representatives to discuss how to make the game safer. As a result, on December 28, 1905, 68 schools met and created the NCAA. This new NCAA instituted several reforms, such as banning mass formation plays like the wedge and legalizing the forward pass. St. Louis's Bradbury Robinson threw the first legalized forward pass on September 5, 1906 against Carroll College. In 1910, the NCAA made further changes like requiring 7 offensive players to be on the line of scrimmage at the time of snap and banning any pushing, pulling, or interference. As the years went on, new innovative rules were initiated, such as the roughing the passer penalty, allowing receivers to catch the ball anywhere on the field, and changing field goals to 3 points, touchdowns to 6 points, and PATs to 1 point. Several coaches took advantage of these new rules, including Pop Warner, John Heisman, and Amos Alonzo Stagg, who introduced the huddle, pre-snap drift, and the tackling dummy. This marked a turning point in college football where players and coaches became stars and teams became brands. Sports writers like Grantland Rice helped popularize the sport with eloquent depictions of games and created iconic nicknames for teams and players, including Fordham's 7 Blocks of Granite and the 4 Horsemen from Notre Dame. Those 4 Horsemen were famously coached by Norwegian-born Knute Rockne, who became one of the game's most iconic figures and turned Notre Dame into the preeminent football program, while also popularizing the forward pass. He would unfortunately pass away on March 31, 1931 in a plane crash. During this early part of the century, sports media also created superstars like Carlisle's Jim Thorpe, Illinois' Red Grange, and Minnesota's Bronco Nagurski, who became not just stars but national heroes. The rise of the game coincided with the rise of technology as well, with the radio helping bring in more fans than ever before. In 1911, the border war between Kansas and Missouri became the first game broadcast via telegraph. In 1921, the backyard brawl between West Virginia and Pitt was the first game broadcast live on radio. And a 1922 game between Princeton and Chicago became the first broadcast nationally on radio. As the rest of the college football world improved, divisional programs like Rutgers and Harvard lost their dominance over the sport. Alongside Notre Dame, this era also saw the emergence of new national powers like Michigan, Minnesota, Pitt, Cal, and Illinois. The South also had rising programs with Texas A&M and Georgia Tech winning multiple national titles. One important game that put Southern football on the map was the 1926 Rose Bowl, with Alabama beating Washington 20-19, earning their first national title. In 1935, the Downtown Athletic Club presented the first Heisman Trophy to Jay Behringer, with the award recognizing the most outstanding player in college football. It would soon become the most prominent trophy in all of sports. Next is the Poll Era, a short but important period in college football history. In 1936, another big moment arrived as the Associated Press began naming its own national champion. See, there was a huge problem that had plagued college football for decades, and would continue to raise questions. How do we decide the best team in college football? Different schools had crowned themselves champions over the years, but there had never been a consensus on who had the authority to actually name a champion. That began to change when the AP started pulling their sports writers to choose a national champion, with the first being Minnesota. The sport continued to grow, and that also meant the growth of postseason play. For nearly 30 years, the Rose Bowl stood as the only postseason bowl game, until the creation of other bowl games, like the Sun, Orange, Sugar, and Cotton Bowls. These games offered teams from different conferences and regions a chance to play each other on neutral fields. Interestingly enough, early on, these games did not count towards deciding a national champion. At this point, college football was now a major sport on par with baseball. Nothing seemed like it would stop its momentum. But a cataclysmic event soon changed everything. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American men were drafted to serve in World War II, and college football players were no exception. As players left, many continued their eligibility at military schools like Navy and Army, who in particular dominated this era. Led by legendary coach Red Blake, the Army Cadets were national champions in 1944, 1945, and 1946. Not by the AP in 1946 though. and fielded two Heisman winners, Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis, who won back-to-back in 1945 and 1946. From 1942 to 1946, Army compiled a dominant record of 45-2. In 1946, Army famously tied with Notre Dame, a team that would go on to become the first dynasty of the post-war era. The post-war era would see the rise of new dynasties and powers, but there was a growing need to address the injustice of segregation within the sport. In 1946, Notre Dame would win its first of 3 titles in 4 years. Led by Frank Leahy, the Irish also captured 2 of the next 3 Heisman trophies, with Johnny Lujack and Leon Hart winning in 1947 and 1949 respectively. In 1951, the United Press International, or UPI, started presenting their own national champion, but this time the champion would be picked by coaches instead of sports writers. The Midwest continued to dominate, with Michigan State winning back-to-back titles in 1951 and 1952, and Ohio State rising to prominence with Woody Hayes leading the Buckeyes to titles in 1954 and 1957. However, the most dominant program of the post-war era was the Oklahoma Sooners led by Bud Wilkinson. They won 3 national titles, but most impressively, from October 10, 1953 to November 16, 1957, the Sooners won 47 straight games, a feat that has yet to be equaled and likely never will be. To put that into perspective, the next longest streaks were 35 games by Toledo, 1969 to 1971, and 34 games by both the Miami Hurricanes and USC Trojans in the 2000s. This era also marked the end of players being required to play both ways. In 1965, the NCAA ruled that teams could have unlimited substitutions, allowing for the development of separate offensive and defensive units. This led to more skilled players at offensive positions and opened up playbooks for innovations like the I formation. One of the programs to take advantage of the I formation was USC, coached by John McKay, who won multiple national titles behind superstar running backs and with their signature student body right. Another innovative offensive formation was the wishbone, which featured a quarterback under center, a fullback behind him, and 2 tailbacks creating a Y shape. Created at Texas, this style would dominate college football in the next era. In response to these innovations, defenses evolved as well, giving rise to formations like the 4-3, 3-4, and zone defense. Even though college football evolved on the field, in other ways, it hadn't moved on from its past. In the South, Tennessee was led by the legendary Robert Leland, and Bear Bryant was leading a dynastic Alabama program that won multiple titles, but segregation was still king, and football was not exempt. For nearly 100 years, Alabama and other white Southern colleges simply refused to allow black players to play or even attend their schools. This refusal only hurt their success, as many black players went to other programs like USC, Michigan State, Minnesota, and Nebraska. Other black athletes found success playing at HBCU programs like Tennessee State, Florida A&M, Morgan State, Prairie View A&M, and Southern, which fielded teams full of talent. But the most successful of them all was Grambling State under legendary coach Eddie Robinson, who became one of the greatest coaches in history. During his 56-year tenure from 1941 to 1997, Grambling went 408, 165, and 15, winning 9 black national titles and 17 SWAC titles. These HBCUs became NFL factories, producing several Hall of Famers including Buck Buchanan, Deacon Jones, Bob Hayes, Ken Houston, Elvin Bethea, and Mel Blount. To this day, HBCUs continue to produce top-tier talent. Racism in college football wasn't limited to the South though. Nationwide, black players were not given their due. One famous example came in the 1956 season, when Paul Hornung of Notre Dame won the Heisman Trophy over Jim Brown, despite Brown having better stats and Notre Dame finishing with a 2-8 record. Still, even in the face of racism, cracks were starting to show. In 1938, an integrated Syracuse team beat a segregated Maryland team 53-0. In 1948, SMU and Penn State played in the first integrated bowl game in the South. The ACC had its first black player in 1963, the SWC in 1966, and Kentucky fielded the SEC's first black players in 1967. Also in 1963, the Heisman color barrier was broken, when Syracuse's Ernie Davis became the first black player to win the coveted prize. Even with civil rights advances in society, some Southern programs still held out as the decade came to a close. That would soon change when the USC made a trip down south. That brings us to the start of the modern era of college football, and 1968 brought a huge shift in how national champions were crowned. Remember that since 1936, champions had been crowned before bowl games, practically making those matchups useless. There were even teams that lost their bowl but were still named the national champion. For example, in 1964, Alabama was named champion and ended up losing to Texas in the Orange Bowl, leaving Arkansas as the only undefeated team. Still, the voters had made their decision before seeing the results on the field. Because of this uproar, the next year the AP decided to try waiting until after the bowl games to crown champion. In 1968, that post-bowl game vote became permanent, and the AP champion began to reflect bowl results. The coaches poll would soon follow in 1973. 1972 also saw the beginning of freshmen being allowed to play on varsity teams, as before you had to be at least a sophomore to play on Saturday. The 1969 season marked the 100-year anniversary of the first college football game, and one of the game's greatest rivalries would be reignited as Woody Hayes and the #1 ranked Ohio State Buckeyes traveled to Ann Arbor to face Bo Schembechler's 12th ranked Michigan Wolverines. In one of the sport's greatest upsets, Michigan would win 24-12 and begin what became known as a 10-year war, as the two schools would vie in high-stakes matchups for the next decade. The next year would feature a landmark game as USC traveled to Birmingham to play Alabama. USC was the first fully integrated team to ever play Alabama and blew them out 42-21, with all 6 touchdowns scored by black players, including 2 by Sam Cunningham. This game would speed up integration in football across the Deep South, with Alabama playing its first black varsity player, John Mitchell, in 1971. After an influx of black recruits, an Alabama program that had been in decline soon rebounded and won an additional 3 national championships within a decade. In 1981, Bear Bryant broke Amos Alonzo Stagg's all-time coaching record with his 315th victory over rival Auburn. The only downside of this desegregation was the fact that HBCUs suffered, as high-end black players chose to attend the same SEC schools that wouldn't have let them step foot on campus a decade earlier. But HBCUs weren't the only small schools that suffered during this period, as the competitive and monetary gap between larger institutions and smaller colleges grew wider and wider. In 1968, the NCAA divided these schools into 2 groups, the University Division for bigger schools and the College Division for smaller schools. In 1973, they split the divisions into Divisions 1, 2, and 3. In 1978, Division 1 would be split further into Division 1A and Division 1AA. In 1975, the NCAA limited the number of scholarships a school could offer, which in turn created more parity within the sport. Even though college football was still growing, TV deals remained stuck in the past, as the 3 major networks had a monopoly on broadcasting games and the NCAA held sole television rights. That meant they picked who would be on TV and limited the broadcast to protect attendance. In 1981, Georgia and Oklahoma sued and won a landmark Supreme Court case, which ruled that individual schools and conferences could negotiate their own TV contracts. This allowed more Americans than ever to view their favorite teams and catch memorable games, like the play, Flutie's Hail Mary, and the 1984 Orange Bowl, which saw Miami upset a Nebraska team after legendary coach Tom Osborne decided to go for 2 and failed. The era also saw an explosion of college football broadcasters and introduced the nation to memorable voices like Keith Jackson, Brent Musburger, Vern Lundquist, and Dick Enberg. While the 70s were dominated by blue bloods like Oklahoma, Nebraska, Alabama, and USC, the 80s saw a rise of new powers as schools like Miami and Penn State won multiple titles. The 80s also brought about an offensive revolution as the passing game became more important than ever. Mississippi Valley State and Jerry Rice popularized the 5-receiver set and set numerous passing and scoring records. Schools like BYU and Houston used explosive passing schemes to rise to prominence, with BYU even winning a national title in 1984, and Houston's Andre Ware becoming the first black quarterback to win the Heisman in 1989. But the best players of this era were still its running backs. Herschel Walker, Bo Jackson, and Marcus Allen all won Heismans. However, the most impressive player hailed from Oklahoma State. In 1988, Barry Sanders had perhaps the greatest season of all time, rushing for 2,628 yards and 37 touchdowns in only 11 games. He even set the record for most 300-yard games in a career in just 1 season. The 90s saw a shifting landscape in college football, as independents joined together to create the Big East, and the Big 8 and SWC merged to form the Big 12. But the SEC had the biggest impact of all, when on December 5, 1992, Alabama and Florida met in the first SEC championship game. Alabama would win 28-21 and set a precedent that continues to this day, as every FBS conference now has its own championship game. The decade also saw the rise of cable broadcasters for college football, with ESPN becoming a major player. In 1993, ESPN would introduce College Game Day, a then 1-hour preview of that day's biggest matchups. The world soon came to love the original team of Chris Fowler, Kirk Herbstreit, and the legendary Lee Corso. The 90s also saw more dynasties. Bobby Bowden's Florida State Seminoles continued a record streak of 14 straight years finishing in the top 5, and Steve Spurrier's Gators revolutionized the game with their fun and gun offense. But the decade's greatest team, and arguably the greatest team of all time, was the 1995 Nebraska Cornhuskers. Defending their championship from the year before, this team dominated every opponent. Their closest margin of victory was 14 points. They averaged 53 points per game and allowed only 15. They were so dominant that they never allowed a holding penalty nor gave up a sack the entire season. They defeated 4 top 10 teams by an average of 30.75 points, including a 62-24 beatdown of Florida in the Fiesta Bowl to win their second consecutive national championship. Interestingly enough, they would share another national championship in 1997 with Charles Woodson in Michigan, who won the AP poll, becoming the third split championship of the decade, after Colorado and Georgia Tech in 1990 and Miami and Washington in 1991. The problem of split titles would first lead to a bowl coalition in 1992. When that wasn't enough, a new way to pick champions emerged, the BCS. For over 100 years, college football had struggled to define what makes a national champion. Was it sports writers, coaches, or could a school claim one themselves? It didn't help that there weren't even official national championship games, and even if there was one, Big Ten and Pac-10 schools couldn't participate as they were contractually obligated to send their champions to the Rose Bowl. That would change as the Bowl Championship Series, BCS, began in 1998. The BCS consisted of 4 major bowl games, the Rose, Orange, Sugar, and Fiesta Bowls, and these bowls would rotate in hosting the national championship game. Participants in these games were determined by a combination of the coaches and AP polls and computer rankings. In addition to 2 at-large teams, every champion of the 6 major conferences would receive an automatic berth in the BCS Bowl, with the top 2 ranked teams meeting in the national championship game. This meant that the Big Ten and Pac-10 champions were finally allowed to play in the national championship if they qualified. Mid-major schools were also allowed to participate in the BCS Bowls, but the inherent biases of voters and computer rankings prevented any mid-major team from playing in one until Utah in 2004. On January 4th, 1999 in the Fiesta Bowl, Tennessee defeated Florida State 23-16 in the first BCS National Championship game, marking a new era of college football. The turn of the millennium saw dominant teams like the 2001 Miami Hurricanes, who were considered one of the most talented teams of all time, and the Pete Carroll-led USC Trojans. That USC team featured 2 Heisman winners, Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush, and won back-to-back titles, splitting with LSU in 2003 and dominating Oklahoma 55-19 to win another. The next season, USC aimed to become the first team to win 3 straight championships, beating the Texas Longhorns at the Rose Bowl in what would be called the greatest college football game ever played. In a 41-38 thriller, Vince Young put Texas on his back, both throwing and running for 200 yards, and delivered Texas their first national championship since 1970. This game marked the beginning of the end of the USC dynasty. They would be hit with sanctions later in the decade, and Reggie Bush would have to return his Heisman Trophy after receiving improper benefits, but don't worry, he got the trophy back in 2024. The next season marked the beginning of the SEC's dominance, with Florida beating Ohio State 41-14. The SEC would go on to win the next 6 championships. Another landmark game that year featured Boise State versus Oklahoma in the Fiesta Bowl. Remember, the BCS had practically locked out mid-major teams, including Tulane, who went undefeated in 1998 but was relegated to the Liberty Bowl. It wasn't until Utah in 2004 that the BCS Buster became a reality. Even with the win over Pitt, mid-majors were often afterthoughts when it came to major bowls. The 2006 Fiesta Bowl would definitely change minds. Boise State and Oklahoma played in an instant classic, with the Broncos using a series of trick plays including a famous Statue of Liberty play on a 2-point conversion to win 43-42. The next season featured the biggest upset in college football history, as FCS Appalachian State traveled to Ann Arbor and beat the winningest program in 5th-ranked Michigan 34-32 on a blocked field goal. This led to a rise in popularity of the spread offense and notoriety for the Appalachian State program, which would eventually move to the FBS, and a decline for the Blue Blood Michigan program, which wouldn't rebound until the hiring of Jim Harbaugh in 2014. That game was the first game broadcast on the Big Ten Network, the first network owned and operated by a single conference. It set a precedent soon followed by other networks like the SEC Network and the ACC Network. To capitalize on its network's success and maximize viewership, the Big Ten expanded by adding Maryland, Nebraska, and Rutgers over the next few years. The Pac-10 soon followed, adding Colorado and Utah and renaming itself the Pac-12. The SEC added Texas A&M and Missouri, while the Big 12 added TCU and West Virginia. Miami, Boston College, and Virginia Tech had already left the Big East to join the ACC. But in 2011, the ACC added Pitt and Syracuse as well. Louisville followed the next year. As a result, the Big East stopped playing football after the 2013 season. The BCS featured amazing games like the Bush Push game and the Fiesta Bowl between Ohio State and Miami, and memorable moments like Michael Crabtree's catch and the kick six. America was also introduced to legendary stars like Michael Vick, Tim Tebow, Cam Newton, and Johnny Manziel, all of whom redefined what it meant to be a college football star. Offensive production also exploded as the triple option offenses of the past gave way to the spread and shotgun offenses used by schools like Oregon and West Virginia. The BCS era was also marked by Nick Saban, who was arguably the greatest coach in the sport's history. Saban not only won a title in 2003 with LSU, but after being hired by Alabama in 2007, went on to win 6 more national championships, including 3 and 4 years between 2009 and 2012. The BCS brought us closer to crowning a true champion, but problems still remained. It couldn't even prevent a split championship in 2003, as USC was ranked number 1 in both polls, but was unable to play LSU in the Sugar Bowl because the computer shows Oklahoma instead. USC had to settle for the Rose Bowl and an AP championship, as the coaches poll was obligated to vote for the BCS champion. There was also outcry as teams like Miami in 2000 and Oklahoma State in 2011 were left out in favor of teams many considered undeserving. In 2001, a Nebraska team that had just been blown out by Colorado 62-36 and hadn't even won their division was picked by the BCS rankings to play Miami instead of Oregon. College football teams were still hungry for a better way to crown champions, one that would allow a greater number of deserving teams to play for a national title, and soon, their prayers would be answered. That brings us to the present day, the playoff era. For decades, college coaches and commentators have floated the idea of a playoff to determine a champion. Bowl games and old money had prevented those talks from ever being taken seriously, but with the BCS's unpopularity, calls for a playoff grew louder. On November 12, 2012, in a meeting in Denver, Colorado, a group of university presidents and chancellors unanimously approved a new system where there would be 6 New Year's 6 bowl games: the Rose, Cotton, Sugar, Orange, Fiesta, and Peach. Every year on a rotating basis, 2 of those bowl games would host semifinal games, culminating with a standalone national championship game. During the second half of the season, a committee of former coaches and players, athletic directors, administrators, and retired media members releases top 25 rankings every Tuesday. 2014 would mark the first college football playoff, and the first 4 teams were Alabama, Oregon, Florida State, and Ohio State. On January 12, 2015, Ohio State and Oregon met in the first college football playoff national championship game, with Ohio State dominating 42-20. The following seasons would feature all-time teams like Joe Burrow and LSU in 2019, and saw the rise of Dabo Swinney's Clemson Tigers, who shed the label of Clemsoning to become one of college football's premier programs, winning titles in 2016 and 2018, and making the playoff for 6 straight seasons. Alabama and Ohio State continued their success under coaches Nick Saban and Urban Meyer. In fact, for 7 straight seasons, either Clemson, Ohio State, or Alabama played in the national title game. This era would also bring some of the sport's greatest plays and games, like Trouble at the Snap, and Tua Tagovailoa's pass to Devontae Smith to win a national championship. These years were also defined by stars like Baker Mayfield, Lamar Jackson, and Marcus Mariota. The 2020 season was shortened by the COVID pandemic and saw teams play an uneven number of games, with programs like Florida playing a full schedule, while some Big Ten teams only played 6. The season ended with Alabama winning the title over Ohio State 52-24. The next season would see one of the biggest changes in the history of college sports, as college athletes were finally able to profit off of their name and likeness. For 150 years, athletes had made institutions millions upon millions of dollars in ticket and TV revenue, but had never been able to partake in the wealth. Student athletes were deemed ineligible, and programs were punished for providing athletes with money they were rightfully owed. Even things as small as receiving a meal would land players in trouble with the NCAA. There have been several attempts to change this, including Ed O'Bannon, a UCLA college basketball star, who sued the NCAA for using athletes' names and likeness for commercial purposes without compensation. On August 8, 2014, District Judge Claudia Wilkin ruled in favor of O'Bannon, saying that the NCAA's rules and bylaws operate as an unreasonable restraint of trade in violation of antitrust laws. The NCAA tried to appeal but was denied by the Supreme Court and was ordered to pay $42.2 million in fees and costs. This was followed by an even bigger class action lawsuit from former athletes, also heard by Judge Wilkin, who ruled against the NCAA in March 2019. That decision required them to allow students to obtain non-cash scholarships, internships, and support beyond an initial scholarship. The power of the NCAA was starting to crumble, but there would be even more changes to come. In 2019, California became the first state to pass NIL legislation in the Fair Pay to Play Act, which prohibited the NCAA or member schools from punishing student athletes who earned NIL compensation. In 2020, the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics, or NAIA, passed regulations allowing NIL compensation for its student athletes. In 2021, the NCAA vs. Alston case was brought before the Supreme Court. The plaintiffs argued that the NCAA's restrictions on compensating athletes were unconstitutional. the Supreme Court unanimously agreed and ruled that the NCAA had broken antitrust laws. This pushed the NCAA to quickly adopt an interim NIL policy that allowed for the first time athletes to be compensated for their likeness and image. This coincided with the announcement from the NCAA that athletes would be allowed to transfer schools without sitting out a year, which had been the previous policy. These changes caused a massive shift in college football. Players now had more power than ever before, but it also caused roster turnover never seen before in the sport. NIL would help push a new generation of stars like Caleb Williams and Travis Hunter. This period also saw an acceleration in conference realignment. The SEC added Texas and Oklahoma to become the first super conference with 16 teams. In response, the Big Ten added USC, Washington, UCLA, and Oregon. This in turn caused more teams to leave the Pac-12, with Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah heading to the Big 12, and Cal and Stanford going to the ACC. This left only Oregon State and Washington State as the sole members, thus ending 100 years of history for one of college football's most prestigious conferences. These years also marked the rise of Kirby Smart's Georgia Bulldogs and Jim Harbaugh's Michigan Wolverines, with Georgia winning back-to-back championships in 2021 and 2022, and Michigan winning it all over Washington in 2023. As usual, fans were never satisfied, and soon there were calls to expand the playoff. The 2024 season saw the playoff expand to 12 teams, with the 4 highest-ranked conference champions receiving byes. This would change for the next season, as now the 4 highest-ranked teams will receive byes, regardless of whether they are conference champions or not. In the first 12-team playoff, the Ohio State Buckeyes won a national championship as a 2-loss team, defeating the re-emerging Notre Dame Fighting Irish 34-23. If college football has shown us anything, it's that even long after we're gone, this game will continue to grow. It will undergo changes in rules and regulations. There will be new powers along with the resurgence of old ones. There will be new stars and personalities that define the game. But no matter what, good or bad, the game will always survive.